What do you get when you cross a war hero with a child killer? Meet Gilles de Rais, once celebrated as the valiant knight who stood beside Joan of Arc, helping crown a king of France. A man who basked in the glory of battle, hailed as a savior of his nation. But behind the banners of victory and the applause of the masses, another truth was festering. One so horrific that centuries later, his name still drips with infamy. Because when the wars were over and the cheers faded into silence, Gilles de Rais retreated into his towering castles. And there, hidden behind stone walls and heavy iron doors, he began a reign of terror unlike anything Europe had seen before. Children vanished into his chambers. Poor boys and girls lured from nearby villages with promises of food, shelter, or coin. They entered his dungeons full of innocence and trust. They never walked out alive. We're not talking about an isolated act of cruelty. We are talking about a systematic, ritualized pattern of torture and murder carried out over the course of years. Hundreds of children, silenced, discarded, forgotten. While France praised him as a nobleman, a defender of its crown, his estates became graveyards for the most vulnerable. And perhaps the darkest part of this story isn't only what he did, but how long he got away with it. For years, the whispers were drowned out by his wealth, the suspicions muted by his noble title, the pleas of desperate families ignored, because their voices belonged to peasants, to the powerless. Gilles de Rais was untouchable, protected by privilege, shielded by reputation, insulated by the blindness of a society that valued status more than justice. This is the story of a man who transformed from national hero to one of history's most notorious serial killers. A story that forces us to ask, how could an entire kingdom allow such evil to thrive in plain sight? Because what Gilles de Rais did inside his chambers was more than just murder. It was the ultimate betrayal of innocence, the twisting of trust into terror, and the exploitation of power in its most horrifying form. The story of Gilles de Rais cannot be understood without first stepping back into the chaos of the world he inherited. France in the early 15th century was a fractured, bleeding kingdom. For nearly 100 years, the French crown and the English throne had waged the brutal conflict later known as the 100 Years' War. Villages burned, famine stalked the land, pestilence moved freely through the weakened population, and ordinary people, trapped between warring armies, lived with a constant fear of starvation, plunder, or death. It was a world built on hierarchy, where the nobility lived behind stone walls, dining on roasted meats and fine wines, while peasants survived on little more than black bread and scraps. Injustice wasn't just common, it was institutional. Power flowed upward and suffering flowed downward. The cries of the poor carried little weight, especially when competing with the ambitions of noblemen who measured their worth in land, titles, and military victories. In this cauldron of war and inequity, the name Rais carried meaning. The family of Gilles was not merely wealthy. They were among the most prestigious noble houses in Brittany, a semi-independent duchy, fiercely protective of its privileges. Gilles was born into power, into status, into a world where rules were written to protect men like him, even when their actions tore others apart. Gilles was born in 1405, into the lavish estates of Machecoul and Champtocé, the son of Guidi, Laval and Marie de Craon. His family's lineage stretched back generations, and their name was synonymous with feudal power. Unlike the peasants who worked the soil, Gilles entered the world swaddled in privilege. His inheritance included sprawling lands, fortified castles, and the unquestioned authority over those who lived beneath his banners. From an early age, Gilles was groomed not only for wealth but for dominance. He was educated in Latin, rhetoric, and the military arts, raised to believe that his blood entitled him to command. While the common children in nearby villages learned survival by toiling in fields, Gilles' education revolved around the traditions of knights and nobles. He learned to ride before he could read, to wield a blade before he fully understood the weight of morality. And yet, the world around him was changing. The 100 Years' War demanded not just rulers, but warriors, and Gilles' upbringing molded him into a man eager to prove himself on the battlefield. His guardians and tutors instilled in him a thirst for glory, a hunger for recognition, and, most dangerously, an understanding that the rules of ordinary men did not apply to him. As Gilles came of age, he threw himself into military life. War was not just duty, it was a theatre of ambition. His wealth afforded him armour, horses, and an entourage of men-at-arms, but it was his willingness to take risks that quickly earned him recognition. Accounts of his early campaigns describe a soldier who was fearless to the point of recklessness, charging into the thick of combat where others hesitated. For a kingdom desperate for heroes, Gilles seemed to embody the ideals of knighthood: courage, loyalty, and the willingness to spill blood for crown and country. But even in these early years, there were hints that his bravery was laced with something darker. His violence was not tempered by mercy. He had little regard for the suffering of common soldiers or civilians. To him, the battlefield was both a proving ground and a playground. What separated Gilles from so many of his contemporaries was not only his skill, but his connections. His noble blood ensured that his victories were celebrated, while his cruelties went unpunished. In a society where the deeds of the lower classes were easily forgotten, every move Gilles made was recorded, glorified, and rewarded. The war offered him both fame and cover: praise for his victories, silence for his excesses. It was in this crucible of war that Gilles' fate collided with that of one of history's most remarkable figures, Joan of Arc. The young peasant, girl who claimed to hear divine voices, became the rallying symbol of France's resistance. When Joan emerged to lead the French army, Gilles de Rais was among the men who stood beside her. To fight alongside Joan was to be immortalized in legend. She embodied purity, faith, and divine purpose. Gilles embodied martial strength and noble prestige. Together, they represented two sides of a kingdom struggling to free itself from foreign domination: the innocence of belief and the brutality of war. When Joan led the French to lift the siege of Orléans in 1429, Gilles was there. He fought under her banner, his sword raised in defiance of the English. His bravery during these campaigns earned him the title of Marshal of France, one of the highest military honours in the realm. He rode beside Joan during the coronation of Charles VII at Reims, basking in the glory of a kingdom reborn. For a time, Gilles was hailed as a hero. He was praised in chronicles, honoured by the crown, and celebrated by the people. His reputation as a defender of France was cemented in history. And yet, beneath the triumphs and accolades, something else was taking root. Because even as Gilles basked in fame, he was learning the most dangerous lesson of all: that he could do anything, and no one would dare stop him. When the wars quieted and the banners of victory no longer filled the horizon, Gilles de Rais returned, home, a man of prestige. He was no longer just another knight. He was Marshal of France, hero of the battlefield, companion of Joan of Arc. Titles and honours clung to him like jewels, and wealth poured into his estates. The castles of Machecoul and Tiffauges became his domains, towering symbols of his status. Within their halls, he surrounded himself with luxuries few in France could imagine. Gold and silver draped his chambers. Tapestries imported from distant lands adorned his walls, and servants rushed to fulfill his every command. To the common people, he was untouchable, part of the glittering elite whose lives seemed closer to myth than reality. But nobility is a mask, and behind Gilles, shadows stirred. While peasants laboured endlessly to produce food, his feasts overflowed with excess. While mothers grieved children lost to hunger or war, Gilles invested his fortune in elaborate performances, pageantry, and spectacles meant to dazzle guests. The man once forged in the crucible of war now poured his energy into vanity. His extravagance was breathtaking, but it came with a cost. By the mid-1430s, Gilles had begun to burn through his inheritance. His appetite for grandeur was insatiable. He sold off lands, pawned treasures, and borrowed heavily to sustain his lavish lifestyle. Yet few dared question him. Who would challenge a Marshal of France? Who would confront a noble whose reputation had been sanctified by his service beside Joan of Arc? His mask of nobility remained firmly in place, hiding the darker appetites forming behind it. Even before whispers of crimes began, there were signs of Gilles' descent. His fascination with theatre and alchemy consumed vast sums of money. He staged elaborate plays involving hundreds of actors, musicians, and costumes, spending fortunes on performances that lasted for hours. Guests marveled at his spectacles, but to the villagers who supplied the labor and resources, the displays were grotesque reminders of the gulf between their suffering and his extravagance. He dabbled in esoteric studies, surrounding himself with alchemists, astrologers, and occultists, who promised him secrets of gold and power. The church frowned on such practices, but Gilles was shielded by rank. His castles, once bastions of medieval order, became laboratories of superstition and indulgence, and then came the rumors. At first, they were quiet, children disappearing near his estates, strange processions at night, unsettling noises behind castle walls. Families whispered of sons who went to serve his household and never returned, daughters who vanished after being seen near his gates. The murmurs grew, but they carried little weight. After all, who would take the word of peasants against the standing of a Marshal of France? This is where the true injustice of Gilles de Rais' story emerges, not only in the horrors he would eventually commit, but in how long he was allowed to do so. For years, suspicion hung around him like smoke, but the fire was ignored. Peasant families cried out, but their voices were silenced by poverty. What was the disappearance of a poor child to men of wealth and power? Officials turned their gaze elsewhere. The nobility closed ranks. Even the church, which would later condemn him, initially looked the other way. Gilles was still remembered as a hero, a nobleman who had stood beside a saintly figure. That reputation gave him cover, and the powerless paid the price. The systemic cruelty of feudal society revealed itself here in its starkest form. Privilege was protection, and poverty was vulnerability. The peasants who lost their children were voiceless, stripped not only of their sons and daughters, but of the right to demand justice. Gilles de Rais lived above the law, insulated by a system built to shield men like him, until his appetites could no longer be contained within whispers. And so, by the late 1430s, Gilles de Rais stood at the edge of a transformation. On the surface, he was still the Marshal of France, lord of vast estates, patron of the arts, a nobleman whose name carried weight. But beneath that glittering exterior, a darker reality was emerging. His debts deepened. His obsessions grew more reckless. His household became a revolving door of occultists, flatterers, and servants willing to look away. And the disappearances continued. This is the cliff where the setup ends and the true horror begins. A war hero returned home with glory, only to become something unrecognizable. Behind the castle walls, the mask of nobility was about to shatter, revealing a predator who believed his title placed him beyond consequence. Because in the dungeons of Gilles de Rais, history would witness a descent so brutal, so relentless, that it would echo for centuries. The mask had slipped, but only for those who lived close enough to his castles to sense the truth. For the wider world, Gilles de Rais was still a nobleman of France, a man whose name commanded respect. Yet inside the thick stone walls of his estates, a nightmarish reality unfolded. The disappearances, once scattered and deniable, began to multiply. Boys from peasant families were lured into his service with promises of work. Young girls, desperate for scraps of bread, wandered near his gates. Some were coaxed in by servants, others simply vanished on their way through the countryside. To the villagers, these losses were unbearable but inexplicable. To Gilles, they became routine. It began with curiosity, a morbid fascination with suffering, hidden beneath the veil of secrecy. Witnesses would later speak of how Gilles turned his chambers into theatres of cruelty. He watched, experimented, escalated. Torture was not simply a means to an end. It was a performance, a ritual of dominance. The children, powerless and forgotten by society, became the canvas for his depravity. But this was not the crime of a madman acting in isolation. It was systemic. Servants carried out his orders. Guards looked away. Wealth ensured silence. Within his castles, complicity festered. His status created an invisible shield, one that allowed unspeakable crimes to unfold with impunity. Outside the walls, families began to notice the pattern. Mothers whispered about missing sons who had been seen near the lord's estate. Fathers spoke in hushed tones about daughters who had gone to seek bread and never returned. But what could they do? To accuse a marshal of France was unthinkable. Their grief remained confined to kitchens and fields, whispered in the dark, suppressed by the fear of retribution. Meanwhile, Gilles descended further into excess. He continued staging extravagant performances, pouring wealth into theatre and pageantry, even as his crimes deepened. Guests at his castle saw a man obsessed with spectacle, a nobleman who seemed eccentric but harmless. None of them asked what happened to the nameless children who drifted into his service and vanished. The contradiction was staggering. By day, Gilles was a patron of the arts, dazzling audiences with grand productions. By night, he was a predator, extinguishing innocent lives in chambers below. The whispers grew louder, but still they failed to penetrate the barrier of privilege. The church remained silent, hesitant to accuse one of its most decorated nobles. Officials who might have investigated were either bought or intimidated. Gilles's name still carried the echo of his past glories, and that reputation bought him time. Time to continue. Time to escalate. And escalate he did. What began as sporadic cruelty evolved into a ritual of horror. Survivors of his household would later describe chambers filled with instruments of torment, rituals performed with the precision of habit. The killings became frequent, almost methodical. He no longer sought to conceal his crimes from those closest to him. Instead, he demanded their participation or silence. Servants who hesitated were replaced, threatened, or drawn into complicity. The peasants, powerless and terrified, began avoiding his lands. Parents warned their children not to wander near his castles, though hunger often forced them to risk it anyway. The fear spread like a shadow, yet still no justice came. Gilles de Rais remained untouchable, his wealth and name protecting him from consequences. The rising action of this story is not merely the catalogue of his crimes, but the growing realization of how long a society can ignore evil when it wears a noble mask. Each disappearance was a warning, each whisper a chance to intervene, and yet nothing was done. Power silenced truth. Privilege strangled justice. By the time suspicions finally began to breach the walls of his estates, the toll was already staggering. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children had vanished into his chambers, never to return. The rising action builds not only toward the revelation of his monstrosity, but toward the reckoning of a kingdom that had allowed such horror to persist unchecked. Because the crimes of Gilles de Rais were not only his own, they were enabled by a system that placed nobility above humanity, and as the whispers grew too loud to ignore, the stage was set for the inevitable confrontation. The unmasking of a hero turned monster, and the reckoning that could no longer be delayed. The unraveling of Gilles de Rais's dark empire began, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with whispers that refused to die. For years, the peasants who lived in the shadow of his towering castles had endured the inexplicable vanishings of their children. Poor families, families with no power, no titles, no voice, had searched in vain for sons and daughters who never came home. At first, they were dismissed, their grief drowned beneath the gilded laughter that echoed from Gilles' halls. What could peasants possibly accuse a Marshal of France of? Who would believe that the same man who had once stood beside Joan of Arc could now be guilty of unspeakable evil? The silence of poverty, sharpened by fear, protected Gilles far longer than it should have, but silence cannot bury truth forever. By 1440, the weight of absence, the sheer number of missing children, became impossible to ignore. Behind the walled splendor of Rais's estates, the cries of grieving parents pressed louder and louder against the veil of nobility, demanding to be heard. What finally tipped the balance was not just parental grief, but politics. Gilles, reckless with his fortune and arrogant in his entitlement, had begun clashing with powerful men whose patience was wearing thin. His lavish spending, his conflicts with the church, his increasingly erratic behavior, all of it painted him as a liability. The Duke of Brittany, whose authority Gilles had openly defied, saw an opportunity. And when whispers of murdered children aligned with the Duke's grievances, the machinery of justice, slow, brutal, and often corrupt, finally creaked into motion. An investigation was launched. At first, it seemed laughable that a man of such standing could be accused of something so grotesque. But then came the testimonies. Servants trembling as they spoke of nights filled with screams, accomplices who admitted to luring boys to the castles, evidence of rituals and bones hidden in the earth. The truth was not only believable, it was overwhelming. The noble mask cracked, and beneath it was a darkness deeper than anyone had imagined. The arrest itself was as shocking as it was symbolic. Gilles de Rais, once clothed in armor and banners, was seized not on the battlefield, but within his own domain, surrounded by the wealth and trophies of a life spent consuming rather than protecting. The soldiers who carried out the arrest did so with a mixture of awe and dread. They knew they were laying hands on a man who had once been untouchable. To see a Marshal of France dragged from his halls in chains was an image that sent shivers across the kingdom. For the peasants, it was the first glimpse of justice, the first time power seemed to tilt, however briefly, toward the powerless. Yet the air was heavy with unease, because everyone knew that what was about to be uncovered would be darker than the wildest rumor. The climax had begun, and the story of Gilles de Rais would never again belong to glory. It would belong to horror. The trial of Gilles de Rais was unlike anything France had ever witnessed. To see a Marshal of France, once a celebrated hero, a companion of Joan of Arc, sitting in chains before clerics and magistrates, was a sight both mesmerizing and terrifying. At first, Gilles carried himself with the arrogance of his station, sneering at the accusations as if they were beneath him. He mocked the process, laughed at the charges, and relied on the power of his name to shield him. For centuries, men of his rank had crushed peasants' voices like insects beneath a boot. Why should this be any different? Yet as the proceedings began, the tone shifted. Witness after witness stepped forward, and what they revealed sent ripples of revulsion through the courtroom. Servants, once bound to Gilles by fear, spoke of children brought to the castles under false pretenses, promised food, work, or shelter. They described nights where laughter turned to screams, chambers where innocence was snuffed out, and rituals that blurred the line between cruelty and something darker. Their words painted pictures so vivid that even the hardened officials recoiled. The testimonies were not isolated. Parents, ragged with grief, appeared before the court, clutching scraps of clothing, toys, or memories of the children they had lost. Their voices shook as they recounted the last time they saw their sons or daughters alive, walking toward the great stone walls of Rais's estate, never to return. For years, they had been silenced by fear and the futility of accusing nobility. Now, for the first time, they were heard. The courtroom became a theatre of anguish. Every detail added weight to the charges: the number of missing children, the consistent pattern of their vanishings, the corroboration of multiple accounts. Accomplices, desperate to save themselves, revealed more. They confessed to luring children with promises of food, to assisting in the vile acts that followed, and to disposing of bodies in hidden corners of castles. Bones and remains were uncovered, proof that could not be denied. What had once been rumour was now cemented as fact. The public reaction was electric. Crowds swelled outside the court, hungry for every scrap of news. To the poor, this was vindication. At last, proof that the suffering they had endured was not a phantom of grief, but the result of monstrous crimes committed by a man who thought himself untouchable. To the nobility, it was a scandal that threatened to unravel the illusion of honour and virtue that titles supposedly carried. If a Marshal of France, knighted in glory, could descend to such depths, What did that say about the system itself? Inside the courtroom, the weight of evidence grew unbearable, and Gilles' confidence began to fracture. His laughter became strained, his mockery brittle. For every denial he uttered, another servant stepped forward with chilling detail. Walls were closing in. The grandeur of his lineage, the echo of his battlefield victories, could no longer shield him. The truth was out, and it was darker than anyone dared believe. By the time the verdict approached, the trial of Gilles de Rais had become more than a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle, a reckoning, and a collective purging of horror. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies consistent, the remains undeniable. The once proud Marshal of France, who had entered the courtroom with arrogance, now sat hollow-eyed, stripped of power and dignity. Day after day, he had been forced to listen as his sins were laid bare, each account chiseling away the last remnants of the myth he had built around himself. For the peasants, who had feared to even whisper his crimes for years, it was a moment of catharsis. Their pain had finally been acknowledged, their voices finally heard in a court that had once ignored them. And for the nobility, it was a cautionary tale, proof that even the highest ranks could be dragged into the mud of their own depravity. When the judges delivered their judgment, the words carried the weight of divine finality. Gilles de Rais was found guilty of murder, sodomy, and heresy. The verdict was no surprise. The court and the crowd alike knew where the trial was heading, but the atmosphere was electric nonetheless. To hear it spoken aloud, to see one of France's most decorated war heroes condemned as a child killer, was staggering. It was as if two men lived in the same body, the knight who had once fought beside Joan of Arc, and the monster who had destroyed countless innocent lives. That duality made the fall all the more horrifying. In his final days, Gilles broke. The arrogance drained from him, replaced by a strange mix of despair, guilt, and desperate attempts at repentance. He confessed, not only because the evidence demanded it, but because the weight of his own darkness had become unbearable. His words shocked even those who had steeled themselves to hate him. He admitted to the murders, the rituals, the cruelties, and begged for divine forgiveness. But forgiveness could never erase the graves left in his wake. The execution was both justice and spectacle. Crowds gathered in their thousands, peasants pressing shoulder to shoulder with nobles, all drawn to witness the final unmasking of Gilles de Rais. The man who had once ridden proudly at the side of Joan of Arc now shuffled forward in chains, his head bowed, his body weakened. He was hanged, and then his body burned, reduced to ash before the very people whose lives he had terrorized. Some wept, not out of sympathy, but from the enormity of what had been revealed. How a man celebrated as a savior of France could also embody its darkest nightmare. Others cheered, feeling at last that justice had been served. But beneath the flames and the smoke, a deeper unease lingered. The story of Gilles de Rais was not just about one man's monstrous acts. It was about power unchecked, about a society that had ignored the cries of its most vulnerable until the horror could no longer be contained. His end was a warning etched into history, that evil, when draped in nobility, can hide in plain sight until it consumes everything. On October 26, 1440, the story of Gilles de Rais reached its inevitable conclusion. In the city of Nantes, before a crowd swollen with both horror and curiosity, the Marshal of France, the hero who had once ridden beside Joan of Arc, was led to his death. The man who had commanded armies, who had feasted in gilded halls, who had lived behind the shield of nobility, now stood stripped of power, waiting to face the fire. The execution was public, a spectacle meant to both punish and warn. As Gilles was bound and the pyre prepared, many in the crowd wept, not for him, but for the children who had vanished into his chambers, their lives stolen and their names erased. Parents clutched their own sons and daughters, mourning not only the past, but the silence that had allowed it to stretch on for so long. The flames rose, consuming the man who had once been celebrated as a savior of France. By the time the smoke cleared, Gilles de Rais was no longer a hero, no longer a nobleman, no longer untouchable. He was ash, scattered by the wind. But if his body was destroyed, the memory of his crimes endured. His trial and execution sent shockwaves through the kingdom. People asked how a man so honored could commit horrors so vast. They wondered how long the whispers had been ignored, how many warnings had been dismissed, how many lives had been lost because society chose to protect power rather than the powerless. For centuries, Gilles de Rais has been remembered as one of history's first recorded serial killers. But his story is not only about one man's descent into depravity, it is about the structures that allowed him to thrive. His nobility shielded him. His reputation silenced questions. His wealth bought complicity. And the poorest, whose children suffered most, had no voice strong enough to pierce the walls of privilege. This is the impact of his story. It reveals the danger of power unchecked, of status that excuses cruelty, of systems that protect the few while abandoning the many. Gilles de Rais was executed, but the injustice that enabled him was not burned away with his body. That injustice, in different forms, has echoed through history whenever privilege shields the guilty, whenever poverty silences the innocent. The legacy of Gilles de Rais forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. It asks us not only to condemn the man, but to reflect on the society that let him exist. Because behind every monster, there are structures that hide him, protect him, and give him the space to act. And so the story ends not only with his death, but with a question that lingers centuries later. How many evils have flourished? Not because of the strength of the wicked, but because of the silence of those who looked away.